1986, Nobel laureate Sheldon Glashow wrote that physics was heading, and I'm quoting directly, back to the Dark Ages. His target wasn't creationism, it wasn't intelligent design, it was string theory, the thing that physicists believe in most. String theory cannot be tested. It predicts no unique observable phenomenon that experiments can confirm or deny. By the standard criterion of falsifiability, it isn't science at all. And yet the most rigorous minds in physics have devoted entire careers to it, not despite the lack of evidence, but through a kind of sustained intellectual commitment that, if we're honest, looks a lot like faith. This is not an attack on physics, it's a lens, because if faith appears inside the hardest science we have, then maybe the story we've been telling, that science is purely objective while religion is purely subjective, that science deals in facts while religion deals in belief, maybe that story doesn't survive contact with reality. This isn't an original observation. It comes from the philosophers of science themselves. I want to walk through 4 specific claims about science that most educated people treat as obvious, and I want to show you, using the work of scientists and philosophers of science, not theologians, why each one falls apart under scrutiny. Claim 1. Science relies on verifiable facts. Religion relies on unverifiable faith. Michael Polanyi was a physical chemist who became one of the 20th century's most important philosophers of science. He made a point that upended the standard picture. The defining feature of science, he argued, isn't observation, it's theory, and theories are actually more objective than direct experience, because they exist independently of the self, can't be misled by personal illusion, and don't rely on individual experiential patterns. Here's the problem with that. We should be suspicious of everyday experience precisely because it gives us the illusion that the sun revolves around the earth. Science had to overcome everyday observation, not follow it, but at the frontier, the same reversal applies. Quarks, superstrings, dark energy, the multiverse. No one has seen or touched these. They are counterintuitive in ways that rival any theological claim. Physicist John Polkinghorne, who was both a particle physicist and a theologian, said it directly. Even the most daring theological speculation scarcely exceeds the boldness of what string theorists propose. Since the early 20th century, scientific truth is judged not by whether something seems reasonable, but by whether it presents a coherent logical chain. Theological truth claims work the same way. Both require a sustained intellectual commitment to things unseen. The operational word for this is faith. Claim 2. Scientists stay detached and objective. Religious believers are subjective. This seemed so self-evident for so long that it barely needed defending. It traces back to Descartes, the idea that a scientist must isolate themselves from their research, must suppress personal bias, must become a neutral instrument through which reality passes. Descartes shaped the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment gave birth to positivism. For 3 centuries, this was the scientific ideal. Polanyi called it a myth. In his 1958 work, Personal Knowledge, he introduced what he called tacit knowing, the idea that all knowledge carries an irreducible personal dimension. A scientist, he said, holds a theory the way a blind person uses a cane to explore a cave. The focal attention isn't on the cane, it's on what lies ahead, but the cane, the theory, is always there, internalized, shaping every step. This personal dimension isn't bias. Polanyi was careful about this. Scientific knowledge is held with universal intent, meaning the scientist believes others could reach the same conclusions. It points toward external reality, but it begins in personal judgment, in intuition, imagination, and what Polanyi called scientific conscience. These are not things mechanical induction can replace. Physicist Fraser Watts put it plainly. The idea that subjectivity and objectivity are polar opposites is an intellectual inheritance from the early modern period. We need to move beyond it. Science, like religion, contains an indispensable subjective element. This has not prevented, and does not prevent, objectivity from existing. Claim 3. Science evolves and self-corrects. Religion is dogmatic. Thomas Kuhn's 1962 book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, is probably the most cited work in the philosophy of science, and Kuhn had something uncomfortable to say about scientific education. Students learn primarily through textbooks, not through primary sources, not through competing theories, through single paradigm summaries of established knowledge. What Kuhn called normal science, the space for teaching students to distinguish between competing perspectives is, in his words, extremely limited, because all scientific textbooks in a given field hold the same view. The goal is to mold students into a specific pattern, the pattern of the dominant paradigm. Kuhn described this education as a narrow and rigid one, probably more so than any other, except perhaps Orthodox theology. And yet Kuhn also argued that this dogmatism is necessary. The single paradigm consensus is what makes science productive. It lets large numbers of researchers work on the same problems without relitigating foundations. The rigidity is what makes revolutions possible. Anomalies accumulate, pressure builds, a paradigm shift follows. Both Polanyi and Kuhn saw it. The scientific community, in structure and in function, resembles a religious community far more than the idealized portrait we were taught in school. Claim 4. Science has universal consensus. Religion is fractured by disagreement. Kuhn mapped this to what we now call mature science, unified around a dominant paradigm, was once a collection of competing schools, each with its own framework. The transition happened not because one framework was proved more true. It happened because it proved more productive, attracted the leading researchers, and won. The consensus came from one tradition winning, not from being correct. Many religious traditions insist their truth claims are real, not merely personal, not merely therapeutic, but real in the sense that physicists claim realism for their theories. If that's the case, then those claims deserve the same treatment as competing scientific theories, contested in public, argued on their merits, taken seriously enough to be wrong. The relativistic response, believe whatever helps you, it doesn't really matter, is actually less respectful of religious thought than engaging with it directly. You don't need to abandon reason, but you need to upgrade your understanding of what reason is. The question isn't whether you have faith. The question is whether your faith serves you, whether it helps you understand reality more deeply, whether it enables you to act more effectively in the world. Your plausibility structure shapes everything you consider possible. Make sure you chose it, rather than letting it choose you.